That's an enormous amount. So when you put those numbers into perspective, yeah, we still do have quite a bit of gun crime, but it's not nearly as bad as some people would make you think that it is based on just the sheer numbers.
Yes, I mean, I know. For example, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you cannot explain these things because no one is going to commit crime because I mean most people, right? But for example, as one example, I know, for example, as a matter of fact, I don't have the statistics readily at hand, but I know, for example, knife crime in the UK, the statistics, they are much higher than the United States.
Sure.
But why is knife crime higher in UK compared to the United States? It's clear,
because we have more guns, and if I'm going to commit a crime of violence, I'm much rather do something that's less personal. The psychology behind a close quarters weapon like a knife, it makes it much more psychologically difficult for people to perpetrate. But if that's the only tool that you have available, then of course that's going to be the one that's higher. Now, if you got rid of all the knives in the UK, then you'd see people using hammers or baseball bats or something else. So, the people are going to do what the people are going to do with the tools that they have available.
Yeah, I absolutely agree because, UK passed different laws regarding, because they had alarming, especially in London area, and a number of knife crimes, also in Glasgow, especially in Scotland. And then they said, okay, you cannot carry knives anymore. It should be that long and this. And then exactly, people were equipping themselves with screwdrivers. Mm-hmm. And I talked to a police officer in UK and he told me, Manusha, we arrest so many people with screwdrivers. And to be honest, I didn't first understand. What? Why screwdrivers? And he said, they use it like as a knife. And I just said,
and it's cheaper.
Yes, exactly. And then he said,
buy one at a gas station.
Exactly. And when they asked him, why are you carrying a screwdriver? Yeah, I want to fix things. Fix what? Right. And then I said, oh God, you're right. I said, okay, now. And then he told me, the officer in the UK told me, okay, Manusha, now what's the next step of our politicians? Going to just outlaw screwdrivers, right? So you cannot.
The crime of violence is already illegal. So outlawing the tool has proven ineffective no matter where it's done. So sure, you want to reduce screwdriver crimes, get rid of screwdrivers. But do you want to reduce violent crimes? You have to deal with the people. The tools, people are going to use whatever tools they can.
Okay, let's go and move to SWAT, please. Could you please tell us, and this is interesting for me as well, I'm sure many viewers as well, what is required to become a SWAT member? What do you think, what are the most important features for a person who wants to be part of SWAT?
My personal opinion is the most valuable tool for a SWAT officer is his or her brain, and ability to be creative and to have minimal level of personal skills that are required to do the job. But the mental aspect to me has always been the most important. There are teams, it depends on the team and it depends on the region as to what the requirements are. Some teams are more physical fitness and strength oriented, which I personally think is a bad formula, because the strongest guy in the world isn't going to help you out if he's not very smart. But there's plenty of guys that aren't super strong or in really tip-top physical shape that can use their brains and can solve virtually any problem that the police here are going to come across. Sure, there does need to be some sort of a minimum level of physical fitness, but that needs to be focused on, I think, less than their intelligence and their problem-solving capabilities. But I'll give you an example from my department, which I think the requirements were probably about where they need to be. There's a minimum shooting skill level. We have a state minimum skills course. It's a 30-round course of fire. And most of the agencies in the state to get on the SWAT team require you to be able to shoot a minimum score of 90% on that course, as just sort of a lowest common denominator to reach this level. So the agencies themselves can make the requirements more difficult, but typically they don't make them less. So our agency, you had to come in, you'd have to put on some semblance of all the heavy gear that we carry, probably go do a mile jog and come back and shoot that course and still be able to get a 90%. So that's a little more than just walking in street clothes or a street uniform and being able to shoot the 90%. But so after that would be the first step you had to pass. The second step was some sort of a tactical course or a problem solving course that involved use of the firearm and some degree of physical fitness. And then after that, you'd have to be evaluated through an interview process. So ours was a sort of a 3-pronged test, and a lot of agencies follow something similar to that, but it's really up to the agency. So hopefully that gives you an idea of, at least what we did for my agency.
Rich, what is the longest distance a sniper can shoot effectively at a target?
That's a difficult question. I can tell you that by and large, the average distance in the United States is roughly 55 yards. The longest one, the last time I checked, was 250 to 260 yards. But most of us who go into sniper teams, and I was on sniper team and actually in charge of the sniper team for a number of years, we will go out and shoot as far as we can find a place to shoot. For my team, that was 1,000 yards, because I get confidence if I can hit a man-sized target at 1,000 yards, then making that 60-yard shot just seems so much easier, and I'm so much better at it. If I only practice at 60 yards, then what's going to happen when I have to make a shot at 100 yards? My confidence level, which, shooting, as in many physical skills, there's a very overwhelming mental factor involved in performing it proficiently. And if I don't go out and train to the limits that I can, then I never know what my limits are going to be, and I'm not as good as I could be. But, speaking to the role of the sniper in American law enforcement, is 99+% of the time, we're not shooting anything or anyone except in training. Our main job is to gather information. And then as sort of a secondary job, if somebody needs to make a precision shot, we have to make sure we have the skill and the confidence to make that shot. But in all the sniper deployments I had, I probably came close to pulling the trigger twice, but never did, because my team was ahead of me and circumstances dictated otherwise. But, and I worked in a major city. And so if you look at the number of SWAT deployments versus the number of times a SWAT team has to shoot somebody, the numbers are very low.
And there are different factors. Please correct me. I'm just assuming. So
Sure.
When I want to shoot at a target, first of all, my mental state is important, correct? So,
Absolutely.
For example, imagine, I can imagine, for example, I'm just making comparison to myself. As a sport or an athlete, in martial arts, if you are in a stressed, if you go and fight, you don't have the good performance. So I can assume this is the same. So your mental state.
Absolutely.
So in your job, wind factor is another factor, right? So the wind, you need to calculate wind into consideration. And the wind factor, your mental state, and of course the weapon you're using, right? So then you need to say that. Is there any other factor which is important?
That is one of the places where, of course, physical fitness is important, because the lower your heart rate is, the more control you have over your mechanical skills. In law enforcement, sniper training is modeled after military sniper training, because that's just the evolution of things and how they came about here. And the military typically has a more difficult job than the police department does, and fewer rules. So in one case, it's more difficult. In a lot of cases, it's less difficult. But in reality, if our average rifle shot is only 55 yards, you could do it in a hurricane and still hit something the size of a baseball without adjusting for windage. So it's not like it becomes exponentially more difficult at distance. The 1,000-yard shot with a 20-mile-an-hour crosswind requires a lot more computation than a 50-yard shot with a 50-mile-an-hour crosswind. So, it is an issue, but it's not as much of one for law enforcement as it is for long range shooters, even 1,500, 2,000 yards.
And do other factors like caliber or the size of the cartridge, the size of the bullet, do all these things play a role as well in sniping?
They certainly do, but how much of a role is often subjective. If we look at ideal circumstances, then if the caliber, as long as it's a rifle caliber, is typically not going to make a whole lot of difference. But when you're talking about, am I going to have to penetrate barriers? Am I going to be firing a caliber that has a flatter trajectory or a more arc trajectory, or what's the velocity of the bullet? The velocity has a lot to do with things, because when we're talking about ballistics, we need something that can incapacitate a person instantaneously. And that's the sniper's perspective, not necessarily so a street level officer using a handgun. The only way you can incapacitate a human being instantaneously is to strike this and destroy the central nervous system, which is essentially destroying the brain. In some cases, the spinal cord will work, but really our training focuses on a high-powered, high-velocity projectile entering the cranial vault and destroying the brain and the central nervous system all at one time. And that causes what they call a flaccid paralysis. And even if you have your finger on a trigger, you are physically incapable of pulling the trigger in, say, a hostage situation, something like that. So that's kind of what our training standard is. It sounds angry and it sounds mean, but it's very effective. And that's our job.
No, of course, I understand that. Okay, so this was this, and about this job. Did you like? You were also leading a sniper team. If you compare these type of different jobs, or you worked as an officer in the street level, which one was more interesting and challenging for you, or both of them were interesting?
The most challenging job is probably the street police officer. Some of the skills aren't quite as refined as they are working on a special unit, but what the street officer has to do is solve any conceivable array of problems by his or herself at any given time. And you can be sitting there having lunch and have a critical incident 20 seconds later that you had no idea was coming, and that you're not even sure, well, I don't know if I have the tools to deal with this or not, because we can't train for every possible scenario or every possible outcome. When you're on a special unit like a SWAT team, sure, some things do happen rapidly and without warning, but we're almost always prepared before we get there. We're always with our buddies. We're never alone, which the average police officer is almost always alone. And so, yeah, a lot of the cities, they run doubles, but most places, police officers police by themselves. And
one person in a car?
Yeah. And my agency still, even with the population and crime level that we have now, we still operate one person to a car. Only very few agencies have the manpower, and the resources available to do 2 people per car. And you usually see that in a place like New York City, where there's a very dense population all in one place, or the time and the resources and the manpower to be able to do that. So yeah, I think the most challenging job is, and probably always will be, the street level police officer.
Rich, I haven't checked it recently, but is Tulsa has the highest rate of crime, or or which areas in the United States have the highest crime rate as cities? Do you know it by chance?
I haven't looked at the statistics in a while, because I'm mostly interested in where I am.
Yes.
especially now being retired and kind of on my way out. So I do pay attention a little bit, but not enough to be able to speak to that specifically. But certainly the more dense the population, the higher the crime rate's going to be as a general rule.
That's general. That's right. And then another question I have, and this is as a martial artist, is interesting for me, and I'm sure for many martial artists who watch this channel. When you, as police officers, encounter someone who pulls a knife, the rule for police officers to encounter that person, they keep telling him, I mean, I watched lots of these videos on Police Academy, right?
Right.
And they tell him, drop the knife, drop the knife. And then if he doesn't, then they shoot at him if he charges at them, right? Do I understand it correctly? Please tell us some about it.
Well, sure. As a martial artist, and I've watched a lot of the things that you do on your channel, to be able to disarm another human being who has an edged weapon is an extremely specialized skill. And even someone who has a lifetime of training would probably say, that's not something that I would volunteer to go do without a weapon of my own. Absolutely. And so it goes back to training. If the average police officer has 400 hours of training, that would barely get you 1 or 2 belts in most martial arts schools that I'm aware of. And here they are, being expected to be masters of virtually every skill. So the general philosophy here is based on the idea of deadly force. And deadly force is a concept that is completely free of weapon types. Deadly force is deadly force depending on how the person is using it. So a pencil could be deadly force. A knife is deadly force. A rifle could be deadly force. A stick, a club, somebody's bare hands, depending on how they are using them, can be considered deadly force. So if a criminal is using deadly force, then the officer is authorized or is okay legally. There's never a requirement, but they are allowed then to use deadly force to counteract that deadly force. So while it may look lopsided that a police officer shoots a person with a knife, they're actually standing on the same legal level because, again, deadly force is deadly force. And the level, taking only a few knife defense classes, it's mind-boggling how many times you can be cut or stabbed in, 3 seconds.
Absolutely.
And without an understanding and appreciation of that, most people don't understand, well, why'd you have to shoot him? So, because I don't want the guy with the sharp thing getting anywhere near me because I know what he's capable of doing if he does. And I have to assume if he's bringing that knife and he's assaulting me as a law enforcement officer with that knife, that must be his preferred weapon. And if that's his preferred weapon, then I must assume then that he is also very skilled with that preferred weapon. Otherwise, it wouldn't be his preferred weapon.
Yes.
So somebody's skilled with an edged weapon, and I am not possessing that same skill, but I have a firearm. Absolutely, that's what I would go to.
Okay. And then another thing which can happen as well, or maybe it happens, or I'm sure it happens, there's some people who want to commit suicide. They want the police officers to kill them. I watched on the Police Academy many of these cases, and there was especially a case I felt so sorry because the guy, kept going to him, and the police, how many times did he back off? I think I counted it 14 times, 1-4. Come on, drop it. And he was basically running away from this guy, and this guy was following. And he kept saying it was very sad. I think he had some psychological problems. He was suffering from some family issues. Shoot me, kill me. And finally, he charged him. I think it was at the 15th time, if my memory doesn't fail. And then he shot him, and then he tried to help him, right? So this was extreme. And then you could see how challenging, and he was really crying, the officer, because he didn't want to do it. You could see it.
Yeah. That's something that a lot of civilians just don't seem to take into account is the average police officer, and again, I'm going to go in the high 90 percentile range, is the best kind of person you could ever meet. They don't want to hurt people for the sake of hurting people. They want to do what's right. They want to protect. They want to serve the community. And sure, they're okay with committing the violence if they have to, but that's not their first choice. And it's anytime you have to be violent, it takes a toll on you if you are indeed a decent person, which most of us are. So nobody wants to commit violence. We would love to be able to talk our way out of virtually anything, and we will sometimes go overboard giving people the opportunity to not force us to use that level of force. But at some point, there's a line that's crossed, and it has to be done.
Rich, another question, because I also teach corporate ethics and business ethics. Do you teach ethics in your police department to young officers?
We do, but I'm trying to remember. I think it's a 1-hour course out of the 408-hour block in the academy. So it's really a generalized overview. It's kind of a way to check a box and say, hey, we've taught ethics. And then it's incorporated into, scenario-based training and some other things, but it's not focused on, and it's not identified as ethics the way that I think it should be.
Oh, so you feel it should be stressed more on that in law enforcement? Okay.
Absolutely. Ethics, and there's a push now, and we've always had this concept of community-based policing ever since I started and way before, but it's become a catchphrase. Oh, we need community policing. We need de-escalation training. We've also always had de-escalation training, and all of those are part of ethics as well, but it's not currently tied together very well with courses in psychology and empathy and cultural understanding and all those things that we really need to have as basic training for police officers.